Hey, Christopher here. Today, we dwell intro stories where people encounter fatal shark attacks. From a freediving instructor who saw a tiger shark pass beneath him to a crab trapper working alone in a mangrove delta. But first, we begin in the open Pacific, where two spearfishermen spent an entire afternoon towing dead tuna directly against their bodies, while something far below them followed the blood trail upward through the dark. August 18th, 2018. The afternoon sky above the open Pacific held a flat, windless heat that pressed down on the surface and made the water look darker than it was. No chop, no current worth measuring. The kind of day that makes the ocean feel cooperative, like something you can work with rather than something you need to account for. Visibility beneath the surface was sharp and clean in every direction. Ethan Morales was 34. He had been spearfishing since his early 20s, starting in shallow coastal water and working his way outward over the years until he was comfortable miles offshore in open ocean. He had the kind of practical confidence that comes from accumulated experience, rather than anything he had been formally taught. Caleb Ruiz was 29. He had come into the sport later, but had developed quickly, and the two had dived together enough times that their rhythm in the water was established. They did not need to talk through decisions. They moved, and the other followed. Neither of them was reckless in the ordinary sense of the word. I think that is the part most people misunderstand about situations like this. The mistake usually does not feel dangerous when it is being made. That is the part of this story I keep returning to. The decision that killed both of them was not made in a moment of carelessness. It was made out of efficiency, out of habit, out of a system that had worked every time before that day. They had spent the afternoon hunting yellowfin tuna along a deep offshore shelf, several miles from where their boat was anchored. The fishing had been productive. Rather than towing a separate float behind them and transferring catch between dives, both men clipped the dead fish directly to waist stringers worn against their bodies. It saved time. It kept everything close. It had never caused a problem before, and so it had never been reconsidered. If you spend enough time around open water, routine starts disguising risk. Things stop feeling temporary and start feeling normal. By late afternoon, the water around them had been changing for hours in ways that did not announce themselves visually. Blood dispersed from the tuna at the stringer. The chemical trail moved outward and downward through the water column. The struggling and dying fish produce low-frequency vibrations that travel through open water far beyond the range of human senses. These are not subtle signals in the deep ocean. They are precisely the signals that pull certain species upward from depth over long distances, not urgently, but steadily and with purpose. The first shark appeared beneath them, making slow, wide, elliptical passes. This is the moment where, if you know anything about offshore shark behavior, your stomach starts tightening before anything has even happened yet. Oceanic whitetips do this. It is an investigative behavior, not a feeding one. The animal was reading the environment, assessing what was present, determining what the signals it had followed actually represented. It was not rushing. When the shark moved in and tore a tuna cleanly from Caleb's stringer, the two men did not immediately leave the water. They had catch attached to them, gear scattered between them and the boat, and the instinct to recover what they had spent the afternoon working for was stronger in that moment than the instinct to go. That is a human response. It is also the point at which the situation stopped being manageable. More sharks arrived. In open ocean, when competitive feeding begins to develop, the behavior of each animal changes in response to the others. The passes that had been wide and slow became tighter. The intervals shortened. The confidence of each animal increased in proportion to the presence of the others. There is no reasoning with that escalation. The only correct response to it is not to be in the water when it begins. By the time Caleb reached the boat ladder, the sharks were moving at a different pace entirely than the one animal that had appeared first. A shark lunged at the fish still attached to Caleb's waist as he climbed. The bite drove into his thigh. Ethan reached for him from above. Both men lost their grip on the ladder simultaneously. The thrashing and movement that followed in the water did not deter the animals around them. It intensified them. Another shark struck Ethan at the lower torso while he was still in the water, trying to re-establish contact with the ladder. A third strike found him before the crew above could reach either man. Both men were pulled from the water by the crew, but neither survived their wounds. Ethan Morales was 34. Caleb Ruiz was 29. They were buried by their families not long after, within a week of each other. The investigation confirmed that the waist stringers had kept the full weight and scent of the catch directly against both men's bodies throughout the afternoon session. The blood dispersal and low-frequency vibration had been accumulating in the water column for hours before the first shark appeared, drawing animals up progressively from deeper water. The decision to remain in the water after the initial contact To attempt to recover gear rather than immediately exit was identified as the point at which the outcome became unrecoverable. Caleb Ruiz died because 2 men stayed in the water when they should have left. The next man got out. He just went back in. March 4th, 2019. The surface of the outer reef channel was glassy at first light, the kind of flat calm that exists in tropical water only in the brief window between darkness and the morning wind. The sky was clear and pale at the horizon. Beneath the surface, the reef wall dropped away steeply into open blue that lost its color well before it found the bottom. Nathan Cole was 38. He had been freediving for 11 years and instructing for 6, and he had logged a volume of open water dives that most people who dive recreationally do not accumulate in a lifetime. He was strong in the water, deliberate in his technique, and had spent years building a systematic understanding of his own limits by pushing against them incrementally and recording the results. His colleagues described him as methodical. His clients described him as calm. Both of those things were accurate, and neither of them was sufficient that morning. He arrived at the site with 4 others on a small vessel. The plan was to conduct freediving sessions along the reef wall during the early hours before the current strengthened. Before the group had assembled and entered the water together, Nathan went in alone. He told one of the crew he was going for a warm-up along the wall. He descended. And in open water, being alone changes the meaning of every decision you make. Tiger sharks do not hunt the way most people imagine sharks hunt. They do not accelerate from depth and commit to a target without assessment. They approach, withdraw, circle wide, and approach again. There is something uniquely unsettling about a shark that does not rush. The investigation is extended and unhurried, conducted with a patience that an animal completely at home in open water can sustain for as long as the target remains available. The shark made its first pass below Nathan during one of his descents, coming in from the open water side of the wall at an oblique angle. He registered it, aborted the dive, and ascended. He held at the surface for several minutes. This is the moment where the story could still have ended differently. The shark had withdrawn. The water below him showed nothing. He descended again. The shark returned on the second approach from the same general direction, shallower this time, and faster in its final committed movement toward him. The strike came during his ascent, at the torso. The force of it drove him sideways in the water column. He did not reach the surface on his own. The crew entered the water when he did not return. They found him at shallow depth and brought him up. By the time they had him on the vessel, he was unresponsive. They ran for shore. It was not enough. Nathan Cole was 38 years old. He was buried by his family the following week. The investigation confirmed he had entered the water without the group's knowledge, diving alone without a surface observer. The tiger shark had completed at least one full investigative pass before the strike. Nathan had registered that pass clearly enough to abort the dive and return to the surface. He held there for several minutes while the water below him appeared clear. I think that is what makes this account difficult to forget. Not the attack itself, but the fact that he recognized the warning before it happened. Then he went back down. That is the detail I have not been able to move past since I first read this account. He had the information. The water had given it to him plainly enough that he responded to it the first time, came up, and waited. The second descent was made in full possession of that knowledge. He went back down anyway, and the shark was still there. I am not going to speculate about what passed through his reasoning in those minutes at the surface, but the sequence of it, the first pass, the ascent, the wait, and then the decision to descend again, is the part of this story that I think about the most. Nathan Cole had a warning he could see. Marcus Lee had no warning at all, only water the color of dark tea and a rope that needed freeing. September 2nd, 2018. Several days of continuous rain had fallen across the region before that night, and the water moving through the brackish tidal channels along the coastline carried the dark, turbid quality that follows prolonged runoff. The surface had the color and opacity of strong tea. Beneath it, visibility was effectively zero. And this is the part where the conditions quietly begin stacking on top of each other. Marcus Lee was 27. He had grown up near that coastline and had worked on the water in various capacities since his mid-teens. He knew those channels at different tides, in different seasons, and had spent enough time moving along them to have developed an intuitive relationship with the environment. It was not a place he felt uneasy. It was familiar ground, or familiar water, which may be the same thing when you have been moving through it long enough. I think familiarity with a place can become its own kind of blindfold after enough years. The task that night was straightforward. The anchor rope on his small fishing boat had tangled somewhere beneath the hull, and it needed to be freed before the boat could be moved. He stepped in from the dock. The water reached his waist. The surface reflected the dock light above him, but showed nothing below it, which in that water would have been true at any depth. Freeing the rope required him to work with his hands near the hull, pull against the tension of the tangle, kick and reposition to find the right angle. It was the kind of task you complete by feel rather than sight, and it required him to move through the water continuously for several minutes. What makes incidents like this difficult is that nothing about his behavior would have looked unusual to the people watching from the dock. Baitfish had been accumulating against the pilings in the hours before Marcus entered the water. Some of them had been injured in the process of being pushed against the structure by current and by predators moving through the channel. Bull sharks commonly enter brackish coastal systems during and after heavy rainfall, following baitfish concentrations into water that would seem too shallow and too murky for an ocean predator. They do not navigate by sight in those conditions. In water like that, the shark is not seeing a person, it is interpreting movement. They navigate by pressure change, by low-frequency vibration, by the specific pattern of movement that distinguishes injured prey from background water noise. The pattern Marcus was generating as he worked, the kicking, the irregular movement, the pulling against resistance near the hull, was not distinguishable from that signal. Not because he was doing anything wrong, simply because he was a person in the water, in the dark, producing the same frequencies as struggling prey. The bite was immediate and single. The shark contacted his leg, delivered a high-force bite, and released. Then it was gone. That is the behavior. Most of these interactions are single contacts, followed by immediate withdrawal. The animal does not pursue. It bites once, releases when it registers something other than what it expected, and moves away. I think the single bite nature of these encounters is what unsettles people the most. One mistake in identification is enough. The people with Marcus on the dock saw him come back toward the surface and initially believed he had struck the propeller housing. It was not until the blood began spreading across the water under the dock light and Marcus collapsed that the nature of what had happened became clear. Marcus Lee was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 27 years old. The cause of death was catastrophic arterial damage from a single shark bite. The conditions that night were not unusual. After heavy rain, in a tidal channel, with a dock light running and baitfish concentrated at the pilings, that water was exactly the kind of environment that produces these encounters. None of the individual factors were out of the ordinary. Together, at that hour, they created something that Marcus had no reason to anticipate. His family buried him that week. The rope was still tangled under the hull when they came to collect the boat. Marcus Lee never had a choice. David Harlan had one, reached past it anyway, and barely lived to explain why. October 7th, 2020. Overcast. A low, even swell rolling across the open water well beyond the continental shelf. The wind was light enough to leave a readable surface between the swells. Conditions that experienced offshore fishermen recognize as productive, the kind of day that pulls people who know that water out past the horizon before most people have finished their morning. David Harlan was 52. He had been fishing offshore water since his mid-20s, starting on larger charter vessels and working his way toward his own boat over the years, a compact but capable vessel he had bought and steadily modified for the kind of deep trolling he preferred. He knew the equipment, he knew the water, and he had worked large fish alongside his hull many times. He was not a person who made careless decisions on the water. He was a person who had performed the same sequences so many times that the risks embedded in them had grown invisible through repetition. That distinction matters. I think repetition changes the way people perceive danger more than confidence does. He was offshore that morning with one companion. They had trolling lines running in open water when one of them ran hard and far in a direction that removed any doubt about the size of what was on the other end. The fish ran for a considerable distance before the drag brought it gradually toward the surface. By the time it appeared alongside the hull, it was a large shortfin mako, a species routinely documented among the most volatile and physically capable sharks encountered in open ocean sport fishing. The fish had fought hard. It was near the surface, rolling slightly, its movements reduced to something that read as exhaustion. Shortfin makos are among the fastest animals in the ocean. They are capable of direction changes and full acceleration from a near standstill with a speed that has no correspondence to the stillness they display when oxygen depleted at the surface. The fatigue is real. The reduced movement alongside the hull is a genuine physiological state. It is also temporary, and it coexists with the animal's full physical capability. David made the decision not to cut the line. The hook was set in a position he believed he could reach and remove with the fish still in the water alongside the hull. He had done comparable things before with smaller animals, and the logic he applied to those situations he carried forward into this one without adjustment for the difference in scale. He took the leader in one hand, leaned across the gunnel, and reached toward the animal's jaw with the other. The mako accelerated from the surface in a single motion, clearing the waterline partially and driving into David's upper arm and shoulder before its own weight pulled it back into the water. The contact lasted under a second. The structural damage it produced in that second was severe. The force of it pulled him over the gunnel and into the water alongside the hull. His companion threw a line immediately and was in the water after him within seconds. David was unresponsive by the time he reached him. They were brought aboard together. The companion ran the vessel in at full throttle. It was not enough. David Harlan was 52 years old. He was buried by his family shortly after. The investigation confirmed that a cutting tool capable of removing the leader cleanly at a safe distance from the animal was present on the vessel and within arm's reach of where David was standing when he leaned over the gunwale. I have read several accounts of mako encounters alongside fishing vessels before finding this one. The consistent thread through all of them is the same. The fish appears spent. The fish appears still. The person involved understands the animal is dangerous and makes a judgment in that specific moment that the risk is contained. And then the moment changes faster than the judgment can update. David Harlan leaned over a gunwale toward an animal he knew was dangerous. Ryan Mercer didn't lean toward the shark. He just needed to free a rope. The shark came to him. January 26th, 2016. The water off the remote volcanic island in the eastern Pacific was cold and extraordinarily clear, the kind of blue-green transparency that makes the ocean floor visible at depth, and the mid-water column looked like something suspended in glass. A light surface chop was running, but nothing significant. The conditions were good for visibility, good for photography, and good for the sharks that came up from deep water to follow the scent of chum drifting down from the surface. I think people often assume cage diving removes the unpredictability from encounters like this. It does not. It only reduces exposure. Ryan Mercer was 31. He had been working on shark diving vessels long enough that the routine of it had become second nature. He understood the behavior of the animals around the cage well enough to anticipate their movements, knew how they tracked the bait, knew the patterns of approach and withdrawal that defined a normal session. He had watched the process repeat itself many times. The knowledge was real. The familiarity was real. That morning, the expedition had run for several hours without significant activity. The water was working against them. The decision was made to chum more heavily, to lay down a stronger scent trail and draw animals up from greater depth. It took time, but eventually, a large great white appeared at distance and began working its way toward the cage, making long, slow investigative passes and tracking the bait line suspended near the surface. The animal was not small. Its movements were deliberate and steady, the kind of behavior that indicates an animal fully committed to investigating, rather than one that might break off and descend again. This is the point where the environment begins shaping the outcome before anyone realizes it. When the session ended and the crew moved to retrieve the bait line, it would not come free. The rope had run beneath the lower outside edge of the cage and caught on a fitting there. From the surface, with the rope running at an angle and the cage in the water, there was no clean way to release it. The snag was accessible from inside the cage if someone could reach the lower edge of the opening. It was the kind of problem that, on a quiet day, would be resolved in under a minute. Ryan moved to the cage opening and partially exited through it to reach the snagged rope below. This is the moment where proximity stopped being theoretical. The great white was still in the water and had not retreated. It was still tracking the bait, still making its passes along the surface, still focused on the thing that had drawn it up from depth in the first place. The shark did not strike at Ryan specifically. It had been committing to an upward run toward the bait for some time, building momentum along the trajectory it had been tracking. What happened at the surface was not a controlled bite. It was a breach. The animal came up hard, made contact, and the force of it cleared the waterline. There was no moment of stillness. There was impact, motion, and then the shark was gone, back below the surface. In the same instant, the crew registered what had happened. One strike, no second approach. The bite to Ryan's torso was severe. The vessel was some distance from shore, and the time required to return to port was not compatible with the injuries he had sustained. Ryan Mercer died before the vessel reached land. He was 31 years old. The cause of death was recorded as severe traumatic injury, consistent with a single-bite shark attack. The bait line was recovered afterward, and the snag was examined. It had caught on a fitting bracket on the exterior lower frame of the cage. The kind of mechanical snag that happens during regular operations. The kind of thing you clear without thinking about it on a day when a large shark is not circling the structure below you. He was buried by his family. The operation was suspended while a full review was conducted of crew proximity protocols during active bait deployment around the cage. The review resulted in a new rule about cage proximity. During shark presence that did not exist the day Ryan entered the water, and regulations are often written in direct response to the exact sequence of events that killed someone before the rule existed. Every story here has happened on or in the water. This one doesn't. The terrain changes. The pattern doesn't. April 14th, 2017. Low tide. The mangrove forest along that stretch of the tidal delta sits in a place where the ordinary boundaries between land and water stop making sense. The root systems emerge from the mud in dense formations that make forward movement slow and linear navigation close to impossible. The tidal creeks carry sound that fills every silence and masks the sounds of movement. Arjun Mehta was 46. He had been setting and retrieving crab traps in those tidal channels for years, returning each season to the same sections of waterway where the catches he knew were reliable. The income it produced was not substantial, but it was consistent, and the knowledge required to do it. Which channels held the best traps, which tidal windows to work, how to move a small flat-bottom boat through the root systems without losing the current, had taken years to develop. He was not an outsider to that place. He was someone who had been going there long enough to feel comfortable in it, which in those particular waters is its own kind of risk. I think about that distinction often. There is a version of competence that protects you, and there is a version that quietly removes the hesitation that was protecting you all along. The zone he entered that morning was restricted to civilians. The patrol boats ran along the waterways in the early hours, and the window before they arrived was the window Arjun had always used. He entered alone, as he usually did, and moved into the interior channels. The area was closed for a reason that had nothing to do with administration. Bull sharks moved through it regularly during the tidal exchange, and the turbidity of the water made detecting their presence functionally impossible until the distance between a person and the animal had already collapsed to something that could not be recovered from. This was not theoretical. It was the documented, recorded reason the restrictions existed. This is important to understand because the restriction was not bureaucratic. It was behavioral. Arjun had been working his traps for some time when the mullet near the surface began moving. In that delta, among the people who have spent their lives working those channels, a sudden push of surface fish carries an unambiguous meaning. It is not triggered by current or by debris moving through the water. It is directional, concentrated, and consistent with something large moving below the surface. People who know those channels treat it as a signal to stop and assess before doing anything else. A bull shark had been moving through the channel on the tidal current, drawn in by the fish activity and the vibration of trap retrieval carrying through the water. The turbidity compressed the encounter distance to almost nothing. It was not tracking Arjun specifically. It was already close, already oriented toward the disturbance, already within the range where the environment had made the outcome difficult to avoid. This is the part that I think people find hardest to accept, that there was no decision made about him, that the animal was simply already there, doing what the water and the current and the vibration had pulled it toward doing. When Arjun leaned over the side of his boat to pull a trap from the channel floor, the shark was already close. The strike came from below, from within the turbid water, at a range that left no reaction time. The force of it pulled him from the boat. Workers in the surrounding area heard something, the boat moving, a sound in the water, and then the channel went quiet again. By the time they understood what the sound had been and located the general area, Arjun was gone. He was not recovered alive. I have read accounts from people who were present for the search, and the detail that stays with me is how ordinary the channel looked by the time they reached it. The water does not hold the shape of what happened in it. Arjun Mehta was 46 years old. The cause of death was consistent with a shark attack, with severe traumatic injuries to the upper body. The patrol boats ran their morning routes as usual. The others found him later that morning in the shallows, near where his boat had drifted to the bank. He had not survived the water. The traps he had come to retrieve were still full. That image stayed with me for a long time afterward. Not the violence of what happened, but the stillness of what was left. The boat against the bank. The traps undisturbed. The ordinary evidence of a morning that had been interrupted before it finished. I have spent a long time with cases from that delta. The detail in Arjun's story that I cannot move past is the mullet. They were moving, visibly, suddenly, in the exact way that water behaves when something below it is actively closing in. He had been going into those channels long enough to know that delta. Whether he understood what he was seeing that morning, I genuinely do not know. Whether he saw it and kept reaching over the side anyway, I also do not know. I am not sure which of those two possibilities is harder to sit with, because either possibility leads to the same conclusion. The water warned him before the shark arrived.